Eleanor Webb hurried through the light afternoon rain, clutching her umbrella in one hand and her worn leather bag in the other. The concert hall loomed ahead, its stone steps already filling with well-dressed people despite the drizzle. She checked her watch, still 40 minutes before the recital would begin. Perfect. She always liked to arrive early, to settle into her seat before the crowd, to become part of the furniture. "Ticket, ma'am." The young man at the entrance barely glanced at her as she handed over her carefully saved-for ticket. She'd been putting aside a little money each week from her bookstore job, just for this annual treat. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, but he had already turned to the elegant couple behind her, his smile widening as he recognized them. "Mr. and Mrs. Donovan, so good to see you again. The Maestro mentioned you might be attending." Eleanor slipped past, used to being forgotten mid-conversation. At 42, she had mastered the art of blending in. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the plush carpet as she made her way to the back of the hall, where the cheapest seats were located. Her gray cardigan and simple navy dress helped her disappear among the velvet seats. The Whitecliff community piano recital was the highlight of her year. For one evening, she could sit in the warm glow of the chandeliers and let the music wash over her. And this year was special. Maestro Alessandro Ricci himself would be judging. The famous pianist and composer rarely visited small towns like Whitecliff, but he had some connection to the mayor, or so the local paper had said. Eleanor settled into her seat, row T, far from the gleaming grand piano that stood proudly on the stage. She placed her bag carefully on her lap and took out her notebook, bound in leather that had cracked with age, her grandmother's final gift to her, filled now with Eleanor's secret compositions. As a child, Eleanor had learned to play on her grandmother's upright piano, the one that now sat in her small apartment. Her grandmother had taught her the basics before passing away when Eleanor was 12. After that, she had taught herself, playing softly so as not to disturb the neighbors, composing late into the night when she couldn't sleep. "Is this seat taken?" A woman with bright red lipstick and diamond earrings gestured to the seat beside Eleanor. "No, please." Eleanor moved her coat to make room, surprised anyone would choose to sit next to her when there were still many empty seats. "Thanks, honey. My usual seat was taken, can you believe it? Some people have no respect for tradition." The woman settled her perfumed self down and immediately began rummaging through an expensive-looking handbag. "I'm Vivian, by the way." Eleanor. "First time at the recital, Eleanor?" "No, I come every year." Vivian looked surprised, as if trying to recall seeing Eleanor before. "Really? Huh. I know practically everyone here. Are you a pianist yourself?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around her notebook. "Just as a hobby." "Oh, how lovely. You should sign up to perform next year. They're always looking for new talent, not, that anyone will outshine Brianna Chen today. She's playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1. She's my neighbor's daughter, only 16 and already being scouted by Juilliard." Eleanor nodded politely, having heard about the prodigy from the local newspaper. The hall was filling up now, chatter rising as people greeted each other. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, air kisses and handshakes exchanged across rows. Eleanor watched it all, separate from it as always. At exactly 7 o'clock, the lights dimmed, and the event coordinator, Mrs. Patricia Winters, walked onto the stage. Her silver hair was swept up in an elegant bun, her blue dress catching the stage lights as she approached the microphone. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 32nd Annual Whitecliff Community Piano Recital." Her voice was warm and practiced. "We are particularly honored this year to welcome our distinguished judge, world-renowned pianist and composer, Maestro Alessandro Ricci." A spotlight found him in the front row, and he stood briefly to acknowledge the applause. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see his commanding presence, tall with salt and pepper hair and the confident posture of someone used to being the most important person in any room. Mrs. Winters continued, "Maestro Ricci will be offering a masterclass tomorrow for our top 3 performers, and we are grateful for his generosity. Now, without further ado, let us begin with our first performer, Thomas Wright, playing Mozart's Sonata No. 16 in C major." A nervous-looking boy of about 13 approached the piano. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her own heart beating faster, in sympathy for his nerves. She remembered that feeling, the few times she'd performed as a child, before her mother had decided that piano lessons were too expensive, and that Eleanor showed no particular talent anyway. The boy played well, if a bit mechanically. Eleanor made notes in her book, not critiques but observations about his phrasing that reminded her of how she might approach a similar passage in her own compositions. She had filled dozens of notebooks, over the years, music that no one had ever heard. The recital continued, each performer approaching the piano with varying degrees of confidence. Some were clearly students playing their examination pieces, others were adults who had studied seriously. Eleanor watched Maestro Ricci during each performance. He maintained a polite expression, occasionally writing something in his own notebook, but she could tell when he was truly engaged, a slight leaning forward, a raised eyebrow, a nod. Vivian leaned over during the applause for a particularly good performance. "He's not impressed," she whispered. "Look at his face." Eleanor had noticed. The maestro's smile hadn't reached his eyes once yet. He was being polite, but she could sense his growing disappointment. She understood. She heard the technical proficiency in the performances, but many lacked that spark, that emotion that made music worth listening to. During the intermission, Vivian went to find her friends, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. She opened her notebook to her latest composition, humming it silently to herself, fingers moving slightly on her lap as if playing the keys. It was a piece she'd been working on for months, inspired by the changing seasons outside her apartment window. "Excuse me, is anyone sitting here?" A deep voice interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor looked up, startled to find an older gentleman with kind eyes gesturing to Vivian's empty seat. No, but the lady who was sitting there might be coming back. I'll risk it. These old legs need a rest." He sat down with a grateful sigh. "Harold Bennett," he offered, extending a weathered hand. "Eleanor Webb." His handshake was warm and firm. "Enjoying the performances, Ms. Webb?" "Yes, very much." She closed her notebook, sliding it back into her bag. "Was that music I saw? Are you a composer?" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Just for myself. The best kind. Music should feed the soul. First, don't you think? Before it worries about feeding the ego or the bank account." He chuckled. "Don't tell the maestro I said that. He's an old friend, but he might disagree." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You know Maestro Ricci?" "Since conservatory days. Brilliant but terribly hard to impress." Harold's eyes twinkled. "I keep telling him he's looking in the wrong places. Real talent often hides where you least expect it." The lights flickered, signaling the end of intermission. Vivian returned, looking annoyed to find her seat taken, but she found another place, 2 rows ahead. Harold winked at Eleanor conspiratorially. The second half began with a technically flawless performance by Brianna Chen. The young girl played with precision that was remarkable for her age, her fingers flying over the keys. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause. Eleanor clapped too, impressed by the girl's skill, though she had found herself wishing for more emotion behind the perfect notes. Maestro Ricci actually stood to applaud, his first real show of enthusiasm. Eleanor watched him, wondering what it would be like to receive such recognition. To be seen, truly seen for once in her life. As the final scheduled performer was announced, Eleanor felt the familiar mix of disappointment and relief that the evening was coming to an end. She always left these recitals with renewed inspiration, but also a heaviness knowing her own music would remain unheard, locked away in her notebooks and in the quiet of her apartment. What she didn't know, as she prepared to applaud the final performance, was that backstage, the evening's careful plans were unraveling, and that in the chaos about to unfold, her life would change forever. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience as Mrs. Winters hurried onto the stage, her composed demeanor now showing cracks of worry. Eleanor straightened in her seat, sensing something was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Winters began, her voice slightly higher than usual, "I regret to inform you that our final performer, Anthony Michaels, has been taken ill backstage and will not be able to play this evening." Murmurs filled the concert hall. Anthony was well known locally, a retired music teacher who always closed the recital with something crowd-pleasing. "We will take a brief 15-minute break while we rearrange our program," Mrs. Winters continued. "Please remain seated if possible. Thank you for your understanding." Harold leaned over to Eleanor. "Poor Patricia. She hates when things don't go according to plan." As people began to chat among themselves, Eleanor noticed a flurry of activity at the side of the stage. Mrs. Winters was speaking urgently with Maestro Ricci, who had left his seat in the front row to join her. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see the tension in their body language. "I wonder what they'll do," she said, half to herself. Harold shrugged. "They'll probably just end early. It's a shame, though. Alessandro, the maestro, was hoping to hear something memorable tonight." "He didn't enjoy the performances?" Eleanor asked, curious about the famous pianist's true thoughts. Harold's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Oh, he appreciated the technical skill of several players, particularly the Chen girl. But Alessandro is always searching for something more, that rare combination of skill and soul. He hasn't heard it tonight." Eleanor's fingers brushed against her bag, where her notebook of compositions lay hidden. She had the sudden, wild thought of offering to play one of her pieces. The idea made her heart race with equal parts terror and longing. "I should see if I can help," Harold said, rising from his seat. "Patricia might need someone to smooth things over with Alessandro. He can be demanding when disappointed." As Harold made his way to the stage, Eleanor found herself standing too. Without consciously deciding to, she followed him, staying a few steps behind as he approached the pair. "Patricia, Alessandro," Harold greeted them warmly. "Anything I can do to help?" Mrs. Winters looked relieved to see him. "Harold, thank goodness Anthony's had some sort of food poisoning. He can barely stand, let alone perform. We have nothing to close with, and the maestro's schedule won't allow us to reschedule for tomorrow." Maestro Ricci's accent was noticeable, but his English perfect. "It is unfortunate, but perhaps it is for the best. I have heard enough for one evening." There was no mistaking the disappointment in his voice. Eleanor stood a few feet away, half hidden by a curtain, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need someone, anyone, to fill the time slot while we rearrange the program," Mrs. Winters pleaded, looking around desperately. Her eyes passed right over Eleanor as if she weren't there. It was a familiar feeling being invisible, but tonight something was different. The music in Eleanor's head, the compositions she'd worked on for years in solitude, seemed to demand to be heard. "I could play something." Her voice was so quiet that at first no one reacted. Then Harold turned, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Eleanor?" he said, drawing the attention of the others. Mrs. Winters looked at Eleanor with a mixture of desperation and doubt. "You play piano, dear?" "Yes." Eleanor's mouth was dry. "I've been playing since I was a child." Maestro Ricci's eyes swept over her dismissively. She knew what he saw. A plain, middle-aged woman in an unremarkable dress, certainly not someone with any notable musical talent. "What would you play?" Mrs. Winters asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Something I wrote myself." Now she had the maestro's attention, though his expression remained skeptical. "You compose?" he asked, his tone making it clear he doubted her abilities. "Yes." Eleanor surprised herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I've been composing for years." Mrs. Winters and the maestro exchanged a look. Eleanor could read their thoughts. Better an amateur than nothing. At least it would fill some time while they figured out how to end the evening gracefully. "Very well," Mrs. Winters said with a tight smile. "We'll give you 5 minutes to prepare while I make the announcement." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, suddenly wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Harold squeezed her shoulder encouragingly. "Play from your heart," he whispered. "That's all that matters." Maestro Ricci had already turned away, shaking his head slightly. His lack of faith was palpable, but Eleanor found she didn't care. For once in her life, she would be heard. Mrs. Winters returned to the stage to address the restless audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. While we are unable to present our scheduled final performance, we are fortunate to have a community member who has volunteered to play for us. Please welcome to the stage Ms. Eleanor Webb. The redicant applause was polite but unenthusiastic. Eleanor walked slowly to the magnificent grand piano, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. She recognized Vivian in the audience, looking confused. Most people wore expressions of mild curiosity or impatience. No one expected anything remarkable. The walk to the piano felt endless. Eleanor had only ever played on her grandmother's upright, never on an instrument of this caliber. She settled onto the bench, adjusting it slightly, taking a moment to feel the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. The spotlight felt hot and strange. She had never been the center of attention before. From the corner of her eye, she could see Maestro Ricci returning to his seat, arms crossed, preparing himself to endure what he assumed would be an amateur effort. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. In her mind, she was back in her small apartment, playing for herself as she had done thousands of times before. She thought of her grandmother, who had first placed her hands on the keys and told her that music was a language of the soul. She began to play. The piece started softly, almost tentatively, just like Eleanor herself. It was a composition she'd written after her mother's funeral 2 years ago, during long, sleepless nights when grief kept her company. The melody was simple at first, a gentle question asked by the right hand while the left provided a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm. As her fingers moved across the keys, something strange happened. The nervousness that had knotted her stomach began to dissolve. The hall, the audience, even the intimidating presence of the maestro, all of it faded away until there was only Eleanor and the music. The piece began to build, growing more complex as it told its story. Eleanor's body, usually hunched and apologetic, straightened as her hands moved with increasing confidence. This was her language, the voice she'd never been allowed to use in public. The melody spoke of loss, the delicate notes in the upper register like tears falling, but also of resilience. The minor key gave way periodically to major chords that felt like shafts of sunlight breaking through clouds. Eleanor's left hand introduced a counter-melody, a conversation between grief and hope. She was vaguely aware that the whispering in the audience had stopped. The hall had grown completely silent except for her music. She didn't dare look up, afraid the spell would break if she did. Instead, she surrendered fully to the piece, playing with a passion she'd never allowed herself to show in any other aspect of her life. As the composition reached its emotional peak, Eleanor's fingers flew across the keys, drawing sounds from the piano that surprised even her. This magnificent instrument responded to her touch in ways her old upright never could, allowing for subtleties of expression she'd only imagined. In the front row, though Eleanor couldn't see him, Maestro Ricci's posture had changed dramatically. His crossed arms had fallen to his sides. He leaned forward in his seat, eyes wide with disbelief. Then wonder. By the time Eleanor reached the crescendo, the maestro's eyes had filled with tears. The music swelled to its emotional height. Then began its gradual descent. Eleanor brought the piece back to its original theme, but transformed now. The same notes but played with a depth and understanding that could only come after passing through the storm. The final notes were simple, a question answered, a resolution found. Eleanor held the last chord, letting it fade naturally into silence. For a moment she didn't move, her hands still resting on the keys. The silence in the hall was complete, as if everyone were holding their breath. Then slowly, almost afraid of what she might see, Eleanor lifted her head. The expression on the faces in the audience made her blink in confusion. People were leaning forward in their seats, many with tears in their eyes. Vivian's mouth hung open in shock. Harold was beaming with pride from the side of the stage, and Maestro Ricci, the great Alessandro Ricci who had performed in the finest concert halls in the world, was on his feet, his face transformed by emotion. The silence broke. The applause started slowly, then built until it filled the concert hall, washing over Eleanor in waves. People were standing now, a rolling ovation spreading from the front of the hall to the back. Eleanor sat frozen on the bench, unable to process what was happening. This couldn't be for her, could it? Plain, forgettable Eleanor Webb, who had spent her life being overlooked? But the applause continued, growing louder. Mrs. Winters was gesturing for her to stand, to acknowledge the response. Somehow, Eleanor found the strength to rise from the bench on shaky legs. As she took an awkward bow, she caught the maestro's eye. He was applauding with genuine enthusiasm, nodding at her with newfound respect. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Webb had been truly seen, and nothing would ever be the same again. Eleanor stood trembling at the piano, overwhelmed by the thunderous applause. She had never imagined such a response, not in her wildest dreams. Her hands, so confident on the keys moments ago, now fluttered uncertainly as she tried to figure out what to do next. Mrs. Winters appeared at her side, beaming with surprise and delight. "My dear, that was extraordinary," she said, taking Eleanor's elbow to guide her into a proper bow. Simply extraordinary. The audience continued to applaud, many still on their feet. Eleanor saw faces that had looked through her for years now focused entirely on her, eyes wide with amazement. She spotted Vivian in the crowd, her red lipsticked mouth hanging open in shock. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the applause. She bobbed awkwardly in another small bow before Mrs. Winters led her from the stage. Backstage was a flurry of activity. The scheduled performers who had been preparing to leave now clustered around, staring at Eleanor with new interest. Anthony, the ill performer she had replaced, sat pale-faced in a chair with a glass of water, but even he looked up with curiosity. "Where did you learn to play like that?" A young woman who had performed Beethoven earlier asked, her voice tinged with something between admiration and envy. Before Eleanor could answer, the crowd parted, and Maestro Ricci strode through, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to shrink back into the shadows. But there was nowhere to hide now. For once in her life, she was completely visible. "You," he said, his accent thickening with emotion. "Where did you study?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I didn't really. My grandmother taught me the basics when I was young. After that, I taught myself." A murmur ran through the onlookers. The maestro's eyebrows shot up. Self-taught? Impossible. He gestured impatiently. No one plays with that level of emotional maturity without proper training. "Where did you study? Paris? Moscow?" "Nowhere," Eleanor said, finding a strange courage in the truth. "I've never been outside of Whitecliff. I work at Hartman's bookstore on Main Street. I play at home on my grandmother's upright piano." The maestro stared at her as if she were speaking a language he didn't understand. Then he turned to Mrs. Winters. "The piece she played. I am not familiar with it." Mrs. Winters looked at Eleanor, questioningly. "It's something I wrote," Eleanor said, her voice growing a little stronger. "After my mother passed away." "You composed that piece?" The maestro's voice was sharp with disbelief. Eleanor nodded, suddenly wishing for her notebook. "I've been writing music since I was a teenager, just for myself." "Just for yourself," he repeated slowly, as if the concept was foreign to him. "May I see your compositions?" Eleanor hesitated. Her notebooks were private, filled with pieces of her soul that she had never intended to share. But Harold appeared at her side, her bag in his hands. He must have retrieved it from her seat. "Your things," he said kindly, his eyes twinkling, with pride. "I think you might need them." With shaking hands, Eleanor took out her worn leather notebook. She handed it to the maestro, who opened it with the careful reverence of someone who understood the value of what he held. The backstage area fell silent as he flipped through the pages, his expression changing from skepticism to concentration, to something like wonder. Occasionally he hummed a few notes, his fingers twitching as if playing the written music in his mind. When he finally looked up, his eyes had changed. Gone was the dismissive glance that had swept over her earlier. Now he looked at her as if seeing a rare bird that had been hiding in plain sight all along. "This is," He searched for the word. Remarkable. Your notation needs refinement, but the compositions themselves. He shook his head. Who are you, Eleanor Webb? It was a question she had never been asked before, and one she wasn't sure how to answer. Who was she? For so long she had been defined by her invisibility, the quiet woman who blended into the background. Now, suddenly, she was being asked to explain herself, to claim an identity beyond that. I'm just someone who loves music, she said finally. The maestro snorted. No, you are a composer who has been hiding from the world. He turned to Mrs. Winters. The masterclass tomorrow, I want her included. Mrs. Winters blinked in surprise. But the masterclass is only for the top 3 performers, and Ms. Webb wasn't part of the official program. I am well aware of that, the maestro cut her off. Nevertheless, she will attend, as will the Chen girl and the young man who played Debussy. The others, he waved his hand dismissively. They have nothing to learn from me that their regular teachers cannot provide. A flush of embarrassment colored Mrs. Winters' cheeks, but she nodded. Of course, Maestro, if that's what you wish. It is. He turned back to Eleanor. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning at the community center. Bring all of your compositions. He tapped her notebook. May I keep this overnight? I would like to review more of your work. Eleanor hesitated. That particular notebook contained some of her most personal pieces, including the one she had just played. But she nodded. Yes, you may. Excellent. The maestro tucked the notebook under his arm with a decisiveness that suggested the matter was settled. Until tomorrow, then. As he turned to leave, Harold stepped forward. Alessandro, perhaps you could tell Ms. Webb what you thought of her performance. I think after all these years of keeping her talent hidden, she might appreciate some feedback. The maestro paused, looking back at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then, to her surprise, he took her hand in both of his. Ms. Webb, I have been judging piano competitions and recitals for over 30 years. I have heard some of the finest pianists in the world perform. What you played tonight. He paused, and Eleanor was astonished to see emotion well up in his eyes, again. It touched something in me that I had forgotten was there. Your technique needs work. That is to be expected without formal training. But your composition, and the soul with which you played it, he shook his head. That cannot be taught. That comes from somewhere else entirely. Eleanor felt tears pricking at her own eyes. After decades of playing in solitude, of creating music that no one heard, to receive such validation from someone of his stature was overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered. The maestro released her hand with a small bow. No, Ms. Webb, thank you for reminding an old cynic why he fell in love with music in the first place. With that, he turned and left, still carrying her notebook. The backstage area erupted into excited chatter as soon as he was gone. People who had never noticed Eleanor before now pressed around her, asking questions, offering congratulations. Mrs. Winters was already discussing logistics for tomorrow's masterclass, looking both flustered and pleased by the unexpected turn of events. I think you could use some air, Harold said quietly, noticing Eleanor's overwhelmed expression. He gently led her through the crowd to a side door that opened onto a small garden area behind the concert hall. The night air was cool and refreshing after the stuffy heat backstage. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The moon hung low in the sky, partially obscured by drifting clouds. It seemed impossible that the world could look so normal when everything in her life had just changed. How are you feeling? Harold asked, settling onto a stone bench and patting the space beside him. Eleanor sat down, smoothing her plain dress over her knees. I don't know, she admitted. Like I'm dreaming, maybe. Or like I've stepped into someone else's life by mistake. Harold chuckled. No mistake. That was all you in there, Eleanor. The real you, perhaps for the first time. I've never played for anyone before, she said quietly. Not really. Not like that. Then the world has been missing out. Harold's voice was kind but matter of fact. You know, Alessandro doesn't give praise lightly. I've known him for 40 years, and I've never seen him react to a performance the way he did to yours tonight. Eleanor shook her head, still unable to fully believe it. But why? I'm not trained. My technique isn't perfect. Perfect technique without emotion is just mechanics, Harold said. What you have, that raw emotional truth in your playing and your composition, that's the thing that can't be taught. Alessandro recognized it immediately. That's why he's so interested in your work. What happens now? Eleanor asked, suddenly nervous about tomorrow's masterclass. I don't belong with those young, talented students. They've been training their whole lives. Harold smiled. Perhaps they could learn a thing or two from you about playing from the heart. He patted her hand. As for what happens now, that's entirely up to you, Eleanor. For the first time, you have choices, real choices about your music and what you want to do with it. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Eleanor looked up at the night sky, at the vastness of possibilities that had never seemed open to her before. I never thought anyone would hear my music, she said softly. I never thought anyone would care. Well, now we know better, don't we? Harold stood and offered her his hand. Come on. I suspect there are quite a few people waiting to meet the composer who left the great Maestro Ricci speechless. Eleanor took his hand and rose from the bench. As they walked back toward the concert hall, she felt different somehow, as if her body was adjusting to being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. Her shoulders straightened slightly. Her steps felt more purposeful. For the first time, Eleanor, Webb walked not as a shadow but as herself, a composer whose music had the power to move hearts. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, she allowed herself to simply exist in this new reality, where her voice had finally been heard. Eleanor barely slept that night. She lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. Had it really happened? Had she actually performed in front of all those people? Had the great Maestro Ricci truly praised her music? Her grandmother's upright piano stood in the corner of her living room, its familiar presence both comforting and somehow different now. For years it had been her only audience, the keeper of her secrets. Now, suddenly, the world had heard what had previously existed only between her and those worn ivory keys. When her alarm went off at 7, Eleanor had already been up for an hour, making tea with shaking hands. What should she wear to a masterclass? She had never attended one before, let alone participated. Her closet offered little inspiration, practical clothes for work at the bookstore, a few simple dresses for special occasions, nothing that seemed right for a day that might change her life. She finally settled on a navy blue dress she rarely wore, with a cardigan that was slightly nicer than her everyday one. As she pinned her hair back, she studied her reflection. The same face looked back at her, plain, unremarkable, with soft lines around her eyes and mouth. Yet something was different. There was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The community center was only a 15-minute walk from her apartment. Eleanor gathered her remaining notebooks, 3 of them, filled with compositions from over the years, and placed them carefully in her bag. The maestro still had her most recent one, the one containing the piece she had played last night. The morning was bright and crisp, autumn leaves crunching beneath her sensible shoes. As she walked the familiar streets of Whitecliff, Eleanor felt strangely disconnected from her surroundings. These were the same sidewalks she had traveled for years, the same shop fronts she passed daily, and yet everything seemed altered somehow, as if she were seeing it all through new eyes. Eleanor Webb! She turned to see Vivian hurrying toward her, red lipstick perfectly applied despite the early hour. I thought that was you. Vivian caught up, slightly out of breath. I can't believe I sat next to you all evening and had no idea. Why didn't you tell me you were a pianist and a composer? Everyone's talking about it. Eleanor blinked, unused to such enthusiastic attention from anyone, let alone someone like Vivian. It never came up, I suppose. Never came up, Vivian laughed. Well, you certainly made an impression. I've never seen old Ricci react like that to anyone. Are you heading to the master class now? I heard he personally invited you. Eleanor nodded, clutching her bag a little tighter. Well, don't let me keep you, just wanted to say how amazing you were. Vivian squeezed her arm. And to think all these years you've been hiding in plain sight. As Vivian hurried off, Eleanor continued. Toward the community center, her thoughts swirling, hiding in plain sight. Was that what she'd been doing? It hadn't felt like hiding, more like existing in the only way she knew how, quietly and without drawing attention. But perhaps there was truth in what Vivian said. Perhaps she had been hiding, not just from others, but from herself. The community center was busier than Eleanor had expected. A small crowd had gathered outside the music room where the master class was to be held. She recognized several faces from the recital, including some of the performers who hadn't been selected for the master class. There she is, someone whispered as she approached. Heads turned, eyes fixed on her. Eleanor resisted the urge to turn, around and flee. Ms. Webb. Mrs. Winters appeared, looking harried but pleased. Right on time. The maestro is already inside with Brianna and Thomas. She led Eleanor past the onlookers into the music room. It was one of the larger rooms in the community center with a grand piano, not as fine as the one in the concert hall, but still much better than Eleanor's upright. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around the piano. Brianna Chen sat in one, looking poised and confident in a crisp white blouse. Beside her was Thomas, the young man who had played Debussy the night before, nervously thumbing through his sheet music. And there, standing by the piano with Eleanor's notebook open, before him was Maestro Ricci. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting with interest. "Ah, Ms. Webb, good morning." He gestured to the empty chair beside Brianna. "Please join us. We were just discussing the structure of today's class." Eleanor took the offered seat, feeling distinctly out of place next to these two young, formally trained pianists. Brianna gave her a curious look but said nothing. "As I was explaining," the maestro continued, "this will not be a typical masterclass. Instead of having each of you perform and then receiving my critique, we will approach this as a conversation about music, what it means to truly communicate through your playing." He turned to the piano and played a brief, technically complex passage. His fingers flew over the keys with precision born of decades of training. It was flawless, impressive, and somehow empty. "That," he said, turning back to them, "was perfect technique. Every note exactly as written, with appropriate dynamics and phrasing." He played the same passage again, but this time something was different. The notes were the same, but they seemed to breathe with life, to speak directly to the heart. And that, he said softly, was music. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Eleanor found herself leaning forward, drawn in by the transformation. The question we must ask ourselves as musicians is not, how perfectly can I play these notes, but rather, what am I trying to say through them? The maestro's gaze swept over his three students, lingering on Eleanor. Some of us learn this lesson early. Others take a lifetime to understand it, and some, like our Ms. Webb here, seem to know it instinctively. He lifted Eleanor's notebook. "I spent much of the night reviewing these compositions. They are unconventional, yes. The notation is sometimes awkward, betraying a lack of formal training. But the voice, the unique, authentic voice behind them is undeniable." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his praise. Beside her, Brianna shifted in her seat, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "Ms. Chen," the maestro said, noticing, "you played Chopin beautifully last night. Your technique is exceptional, for someone your age, but I wonder, do you know why Chopin wrote the ballade?" What he was trying to express, Brianna straightened. It was inspired by Adam Mickiewicz's poems about Polish exiles. Chopin wrote it during his own exile from Poland. Yes, that's the historical context. But when you play it, what are you trying to express? The girl hesitated. "I try to express what Chopin intended." "And what do you believe that was?" "Longing," Brianna said after a moment. "Homesickness, patriotism." The maestro nodded. "All correct. But I didn't hear those emotions in your playing last night. I heard excellent technique, a perfect reproduction of the notes on the page. But I didn't hear Brianna Chen speaking through Chopin. He turned to Thomas. And you, young man. Your Debussy was competent, but did you feel the impressionist spirit of the piece? The play of light on water that inspired him? Thomas swallowed hard. I tried to, sir. Yes, I believe you did. The maestro's tone softened. And that intention is the beginning. Now we must bridge the gap between intention and expression. Finally, he turned to Eleanor. Ms. Webb, when you played your composition last night, what were you trying to express? Eleanor thought about it. Grief, she said quietly, but also survival. How life continues even after loss. How beauty can exist alongside pain. Yes, the maestro said simply, and everyone in that hall felt it. That is the gift you have. The ability to translate your deepest emotions into sound in a way that others can understand. He placed her notebook on the piano stand. I would like you to play something else for us. Something different from last night's piece. Show us another facet of your voice. Eleanor's heart began to race. This was different from the recital. There, in the dim light with the audience at a distance, she had been able to lose herself in the music. Here in this bright room with only 3 people watching intently, she felt exposed, vulnerable. But the maestro was waiting, his expression encouraging, and something in his words had resonated with her. The idea that music was, at its core, about communication, about speaking truth through sound. She rose slowly and moved to the piano. Leafing through her notebook, she found a piece she had written 2 summers ago, during a rare vacation to the coast. It was lighter than the one she had played at the recital, full of movement and light, inspired by the rhythm of waves and the dance of sunlight on water. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. Once again, the world fell away as the music took over. This piece was joyful, alive with wonder and possibility. Her fingers danced across the keys, less technically perfect than Brianna's, but infused with an energy that made technique seem secondary. She played with her whole body, swaying slightly with the rhythm, her face reflecting the changing moods of the piece. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the maestro began to applaud, joined by Thomas. Even Brianna, after a moment of hesitation, brought her hands together in reluctant appreciation. That, said the maestro, is what I want you all to strive for. Not perfection, connection. Ms. Webb connects with her music completely, without reservation or self-consciousness. That is why her playing moves us, despite any technical limitations. He spent the next 2 hours working with each of them individually. With Brianna, he focused on helping her find personal meaning in Chopin's work, encouraging her to bring her own experiences to the music. With Thomas, he worked on releasing tension, on allowing himself to feel the music physically, instead of approaching it only intellectually. With Eleanor, he addressed some of her technical gaps, showing her more efficient fingerings, helping her understand formal structures that would strengthen her compositions. But he was careful, she noticed, not to tamper with the essential quality that made her playing unique. Your lack of formal training has, in some ways, been a blessing, he told her as she worked through a difficult passage. You have developed your own solutions, your own approach. We can refine your technique without losing that originality. As the masterclass drew to a close, the maestro gathered them together once more. Music is both highly personal and universal, he said. It is a paradox. The more authentically you express your unique truth, the more deeply it will resonate. With others, remember this, always. He turned to Eleanor. Ms. Webb, might I have a word with you privately before you leave? Brianna and Thomas packed up their things and left. Thomas with a friendly nod to Eleanor. Brianna with a complex expression that mingled respect with something like resentment. When they were alone, the maestro gestured for Eleanor to sit beside him on the piano bench. I have a proposition for you, he said without preamble. I teach at the National Conservatory 6 months of the year. The spring semester begins in January. I would like you to consider applying for a special adult study program we offer. Eleanor stared at him in shock. But I have no formal qualifications. I can't even read music properly. Qualifications can be waived in exceptional cases, and you have already proven yourself exceptional. His eyes were serious. "You have a rare gift, Ms. Webb. It would be wrong to let it remain hidden in this small town. Played only on an upright piano in an empty apartment." The idea was so far beyond anything Eleanor had ever imagined for herself that she could barely process it. Leave Whitecliff? Study at the National Conservatory? It seemed impossible. "I have a job," she said weakly. "A life here?" "And you would have a different life there," he replied simply. "The choice, of course, is yours. But I want you to know that the opportunity exists." He handed her a card with his contact information. "Think about it. Call me within the month if you're interested, and I will help arrange the details." Eleanor took the card, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. The maestro smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "No, Eleanor Webb. Thank you for reminding an old musician what music is truly for." As she left the community center, stepping back into the autumn sunshine, Eleanor felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The familiar streets of Whitecliff suddenly seemed different, not because they had changed, but because she had. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Webb had choices. Real choices about who she might become and what her music might mean to the world. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She clutched the maestro's card in her hand like a talisman as she walked home, her mind already filling with new melodies, music of possibility, of transformation, of a life suddenly, unexpectedly, opening up before her. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur for Eleanor. Word of her performance had spread through Whitecliff like wildfire. Customers at the bookstore who had never noticed her before now came in specifically to talk to her. Mrs. Winters called 3 times to tell her about people asking for recordings of her music. Even her landlady, who had barely spoken 10 words to her in 5 years, stopped her in the hallway to say she'd heard Eleanor was some kind of piano genius. It was overwhelming. Eleanor found herself retreating to her apartment each evening, seeking refuge in the familiar comfort of her piano and her solitude. But even there, things had changed. When she played now, she couldn't help but imagine others listening. The private conversation between herself and her music had somehow become public. And always, tucked in her wallet, was Maestro Ricci's card. She took it out sometimes, running her fingers over the embossed lettering, the prestigious address of the National Conservatory. A door to another life, waiting to be opened. "You're distracted today," said Mr. Hartman, the bookstore owner, as Eleanor mistakenly shelved a mystery novel in the biography section for the 3rd time that morning. "I'm sorry," she said, quickly retrieving the misplaced book. "I have a lot on my mind." Mr. Hartman nodded sympathetically. He was a kind man in his 60s who had owned the bookstore for as long as Eleanor had worked there. "I can imagine. Quite a change having everyone suddenly know who you are." Eleanor smiled faintly. "It's strange. Have you decided yet? About the conservatory offer?" News traveled fast in Whitecliff. Eleanor had mentioned the maestro's proposition only to Harold, but somehow everyone seemed to know about it. "Not yet," she admitted. "It's a big decision." Mr. Hartman picked up a stack of new arrivals and began placing them on the display table. "You know," he said casually, "when my wife was alive, she used to say that at the end of our lives we regret the chances we didn't take more than the ones we did." Eleanor looked up, surprised. Mr. Hartman rarely spoke of his wife, who had passed away before Eleanor started working at the store. "She sounds wise," Eleanor said softly. She was. Mr. Hartman smiled at the memory. "And stubborn. Wouldn't let me talk her out of anything once she set her mind to it." He placed the last book on the display and turned to face Eleanor fully. "Your job will be here if things don't work out, you know. Whitecliff isn't going anywhere." The simple kindness of his offer brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, as autumn rain tapped against her windows, Eleanor sat at her piano, not playing, just thinking. The choice before her seemed impossible. Stay in Whitecliff, in the safety of everything familiar, or leap into the unknown, a new city, Formal study at her age, a complete reinvention of her life. She was still sitting there, lost in thought, when her doorbell rang. Startled, she rarely had visitors. Eleanor went to answer it. Harold stood in the hallway, raindrops glistening on his coat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, "but I have something for you." Eleanor invited him in, quickly clearing sheet music from her small sofa to make room for him to sit. "It's from Alessandro," Harold said, handing her a large envelope. "He asked me to deliver it personally." Eleanor took the envelope with curious hands. Inside was a letter and several printed pages of what appeared to be sheet music. She opened the letter first. "Dear Ms. Webb," it began in the Maestro's elegant handwriting, "I have taken the liberty of having your composition, the one you performed at the recital, professionally transcribed. My publisher is interested in including it in a collection of contemporary piano works to be released next spring. With your permission, of course. The payment would be modest for a first publication, but it would introduce your work to a wider audience. Please consider this regardless of your decision about the conservatory." Eleanor stared at the pages in disbelief, her music printed in proper notation looking so official, so real. "He thinks very highly of your work," Harold said gently. "We both do." "I don't know what to do," Eleanor admitted, setting the pages carefully on her coffee table. "Everything is happening so fast. 2 weeks ago no one even knew I played piano, and now the world is opening up to you." Harold finished for her. "It's terrifying, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, grateful that he understood. "May I tell you a story?" Harold asked. When Eleanor nodded again, he settled back on the sofa. "When I was young, about the age of that Chen girl, I was considered quite promising as a violinist. I played in youth orchestras, won competitions. Everyone said I had a bright future ahead of me." Eleanor listened, surprised. She had known Harold was musical but had never heard this part of his history. "Alessandro and I were at conservatory together. He was already exceptional, destined for greatness. I was good. Just good." Harold smiled without bitterness. "When the time came to really commit to music as a career, to pour everything into it, I hesitated. I told myself I was being practical, that the odds of success were too slim. So I chose a different path: law school, a respectable career, financial security." "You regret it?" Eleanor asked softly. Harold considered the question. "Not exactly. I had a good life, a successful career, but there has always been a whisper in the back of my mind, a question of what might have been if I'd had the courage to try." He leaned forward. "The thing is, Eleanor, I didn't have what you have. I had technical skill, yes, but not that rare ability to speak directly to the heart through music. You have that gift. And gifts like that come with a kind of responsibility." "Responsibility?" "To share them with the world," Harold said simply. "Your music touched people, Eleanor. It moved them. Think about that night at the recital. How many people left the hall feeling something they hadn't felt before, understanding something they hadn't understood before, because of what you created?" Eleanor had never thought of her music that way, as something that might matter to others, that might actually make a difference in the world beyond her small apartment. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "I'm 42 years old. I've never lived anywhere but Whitecliff. What if I go to the conservatory and fail? What if I'm not good enough?" "Then you'll come back to Whitecliff having tried something brave," Harold said. "But what if you succeed? What if your music reaches people all over the world? What if your compositions are played in concert halls and living rooms for generations to come?" The possibility was so vast, so far beyond anything Eleanor had ever allowed herself to imagine, that it took her breath away. Harold stood to leave. "Alessandro needs your answer by the end of the week. For what it's worth, I think you already know what you want to do. You're just gathering the courage to do it." After he left, Eleanor returned to her piano. She looked at it with new eyes, not just as her private confidant, but as a conduit between her inner world and the larger one outside her door. She played a few notes, feeling the familiar response of the keys beneath her fingers. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number on Maestro Ricci's card. 3 months later, On a crisp January morning, Eleanor stood in front of her open suitcase, trying to decide what else to pack. Her apartment looked bare, most of her belongings already boxed up for storage. Mr. Hartman had given her a leave of absence from the bookstore. Her landlady had agreed to rent her apartment on a month-to-month basis, just until you decide if this music business is going to work out. The train to the city would leave in 2 hours. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she folded the last of her clothes. Was she really doing this? At her age, starting over completely? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Harold stood there with Mrs. Winters and, to Eleanor's surprise, Brianna Chen and her mother. "We came to see you off," Harold explained. "And to give you this," Mrs. Winters added, handing Eleanor a small, wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful, leather-bound music notebook, far nicer than any Eleanor had ever owned. "From the Whitecliff Music Society," Mrs. Winters said, "for your new compositions." "And this is from me," Brianna said, stepping forward with a folder. Her voice was shy but determined. "I've been practicing your piece, the one from the recital. Maestro Ricci helped me with some of the interpretations last time he visited. I thought maybe, when you come back to visit, you could tell me if I'm playing it right." Eleanor was touched beyond words. The girl who had seemed resentful of her at the master class was now asking for her guidance. "I'd be honored," she said, taking the folder. Inside was a handwritten copy of her composition, with Brianna's careful notations. Mrs. Chen smiled warmly. "My daughter has talked of nothing else since the master class. She says you showed her what it really means to play with heart." As they helped Eleanor carry her bags to the taxi waiting outside, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and excitement. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, the safe, predictable life she had built for herself. But she was moving toward something else, something that had been waiting inside her all along. At the train station, Harold gave her a fatherly hug. "Remember," he said, "music is the voice of the soul. Your soul has been whispering for years. Now it's time to let it sing." As the train pulled away from Whitecliff, Eleanor watched her small town recede into the distance. She touched her bag, feeling the shape of her notebooks inside, the old ones filled with compositions from her past life, and the new one, its pages blank, waiting for the music of her future. In her mind, she could already hear it beginning to play, a melody of courage and transformation, of a plain woman who had finally, after all these years, allowed herself to be truly seen.